Get your ugly concrete slab out of my sight, or I'll have it ripped apart myself.
Ma'am, my father built that pad. It's a registered...
Registered? With who? The Junkyard Association? It's an eyesore. It's disgusting. You and your rusty little helicopter make this whole neighborhood look like a dump.
It's registered with the federal...
I don't care if it's registered with God. I am the HOA. Your pathetic little playground is going. One way or another.
She meant it. While I was 400 miles away, she hired a crew to jackhammer my father's helipad into rubble. She should have let me finish that sentence, because the agency that pad was registered with doesn't send letters. They send investigators in dark suits. Have you ever watched someone so powerful, so untouchable, so convinced the rules don't apply to them, crumble the moment a federal badge appears at their front door? Because you are about to drop a comment and hit like, and let me take you back to where this all started. The county road that leads to our ranch is called Calloway Ridge Road, and it's been called that since before the county bothered paving it. My grandfather, Roy Calloway Sr., bought 95 acres of Texas hill country limestone and live oak in 1959 with cash he'd saved from 22 years of pipeline welding across West Texas. He paid $11 an acre. The deed is still in the family safe, handwritten, notarized by a justice of the peace in a feed store, and it's worth more to me than anything a real estate developer has ever put on glossy paper. The land sits on a limestone ridge about 50 miles northwest of Austin, outside Marble Falls. From the top of the ridge you can see 40 miles of hill country in every direction, cedar breaks, granite outcrops, cattle pasture, rolling all the way to the horizon. On clear mornings, the sky turns that shade of pale gold that only happens in central Texas, and the wind comes up from the Pedernales River Valley, smelling like juniper and warm stone. My father grew up on that ridge. I grew up on that ridge. My son is growing up on that ridge right now. My name is Nathan Calloway. I'm 46 years old. I spent 22 years in the United States Army as a helicopter pilot. Chief Warrant Officer, 4 Black Hawk driver, 3 combat deployments. I flew medevac in Iraq during the surge. I flew resupply missions in Afghanistan's Kunar province, where the mountains were so close you could smell the pine trees through the engine exhaust. And I flew disaster relief in Louisiana after Hurricane Harvey. I have 4,300 hours of rotary wing flight time, a commercial helicopter certificate with instrument rating, and a back that reminds me of every hard landing I ever made, every time the barometric pressure drops. When I retired in 2018, I came home to the ranch, kissed my son Colton on the forehead, and started an aerial survey and agricultural consulting business, wildfire assessment, livestock counts over rough terrain, fence line inspections on properties too big to drive, the kind of work that takes a helicopter, a topographic map, and somebody who isn't afraid to fly 100 feet off the deck in 30-knot crosswinds. I fly a Robinson R-44 Raven II. It's parked on the same concrete pad my father built. My father, Roy Calloway Jr., was an Army aviator himself, Vietnam 1st Cavalry Division Huey pilot, 67 combat missions in the Ia Drang Valley. He came home in 1970 with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a hearing loss in his left ear that he blamed on the transmission whine of a Bell UH-1 for the rest of his life. He never talked about Vietnam, except once when I was 14 and told him I wanted to fly helicopters. He looked at me for a long time and said, "Flying is the best thing I ever did, and the worst place I ever did it. If you want to fly, fly. But do it over something worth looking at." In 1997, when I was 18 and had just earned my private pilot's license at a flight school in San Marcos, my father built the helipad. He designed it himself, hired a concrete crew out of Burnett, and spent 3 weekends pouring and finishing a 60 by 60 foot reinforced pad on the flat shelf below the ridge house. He installed perimeter edge lighting, green and amber exactly to FAA Advisory Circular 1505390-2C specifications, a lighted windsock on a 20-foot steel mast, a painted touchdown circle with a white H at center, and 4 tie-down anchor points set in the concrete with J-bolts. He built a small equipment shed next to the pad for fuel storage, tools, and a workbench. He wired the lighting to a switch panel inside the shed and tested every bulb himself. Then he registered it with the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA Form 7480-1, Notice of Landing Area Proposal, Private Use Heliport, Calloway Ridge, Burnett County, Texas. Entered into the Airport Master Record Database under FAA Order 5010.4b. Assigned a location identifier, listed in the chart supplement. Filed, acknowledged, and recorded by the FAA Southwest Regional Office in Fort Worth. That helipad has been a registered federal aviation facility since October 14, 1997. My father stood on that pad the day I soloed for the first time, shielding his eyes against the sun, and when I set down and killed the engine, he walked over and put his hand on the skid and said, "That's the prettiest landing I've ever seen. Your mother would have hated every second of it." She would have. She died of pancreatic cancer in 1994. She never saw me fly. But my father watched every takeoff and every landing from that pad for 21 years, standing in the same spot, hand over his eyes, until the day he couldn't stand anymore. He died in 2019, 13 months after I retired. Congestive heart failure. He was 71 years old. Colton and I scattered his ashes from the R-44, 200 feet over the ridge, on a morning so clear you could see the Capitol Dome in Austin. My son held the urn. He was 8 years old. He didn't cry. He just held it with both hands and said, "Bye, Grandpa Roy. We'll keep flying." That helipad is not a luxury. It is not a hobby. It is not a decoration. It is my business, my family's legacy, and the last thing my father built with his own hands. It is also, and this matters more than anything, a facility registered with the United States Federal Aviation Administration, a fact that the HOA president of Ridgeview Bluffs Estates was about to learn in the most expensive way possible. Ridgeview Bluffs Estates was built in 2016 by a developer named Craig Whitmore on 160 acres of former ranch land directly south of our property. Craig bought the land from a widow named Betty Kessler, bulldozed the old stone ranch house, dynamited the limestone ledges to flatten the lots, and built a gated community with 118 homes, a clubhouse, 2 tennis courts, a resort-style pool, and a marketing brochure that promised elevated hill country living with panoramic views. The homes started at $850,000. The premium lots, the ones on the North Ridge with views toward our property, sold for an extra $60,000 to $90,000 because the view included rolling pasture, live oaks, and wide-open Texas sky. The brochure did not mention that the wide-open Texas sky occasionally contained a helicopter. The HOA president was named Brenda Haskell, 38 years old, which she would tell you unprompted, usually in the same sentence as the name of her Pilates instructor, her esthetician, and the brand of collagen powder she dissolved in her morning matcha. 5'9" in bare feet, 5'11" in the Valentino rock stud heels she wore to board meetings, the way a general wears medals, not because the occasion required them, but because power needs a pedestal. Honey blonde hair that fell in salon-perfect waves past her shoulders, cheekbones sharp enough to slice a building permit in half, and eyes the color of aged bourbon, luminous, warm, and absolutely devoid of anything you could mistake for a conscience. She was, by every conventional standard, a stunningly beautiful woman. The kind of beautiful that made men walk into lampposts and women check their reflections in the nearest window. The kind of beautiful that had, according to the HOA's own rumor mill, ended one marriage, started 2 lawsuits, and gotten a parking ticket dismissed in Burnett County without a single word being spoken, just a tilt of the head, a slight adjustment of the sunglasses, and a smile that arrived like a weapon designed to look like a gift. She was also the kind of beautiful that made you forget for just long enough that the woman behind the face was entirely, irreparably, spectacularly mean. She had received the house, a 4-bedroom limestone and glass showcase on Lot 7, the premium ridge lot in her divorce settlement, from a software executive named Todd Haskell, who moved to Belize 6 weeks after the papers were signed and hadn't been heard from since. Most men leave marriages. Todd left the continent. That should tell you everything about what it was like to share a breakfast table with Brenda Haskell. She took the house, the Peloton, the wine cellar, and the HOA presidency, and she ran all four with the ferocity of a woman who had discovered that controlling other people was cheaper than therapy and significantly more entertaining. She drove a pearl-white Cadillac Escalade with the vanity plate blue Prez. She wore Lululemon to morning patrols, not the casual kind, the structured, matching set kind in limited edition colors like smoked spruce and roasted brown, that cost $400 and signaled that you were the kind of woman who took both her glutes and her authority extremely seriously. She carried a custom tablet loaded with an HOA enforcement app she'd paid a developer $6,000 to build. It had violation categories, photo upload, GPS tagging, and a severity slider that went from minor to existential threat to community standards. She used the existential setting the way most people use a doorbell, reflexively frequently, and for situations that did not require it. For board meetings, she upgraded. Chanel tweed blazer over a silk camisole, wide-leg Dior trousers, Cartier tank watch on one wrist, Van Cleef Alhambra bracelet on the other. She had a Birkin Hermes 40 cm Etoupe Togo leather gold hardware that she carried exclusively to violation hearings, as though the bag itself might intimidate homeowners into compliance. It probably did. When you're being fined $200 for a garden gnome, and the woman issuing the fine is carrying a bag that costs more than your car payment, your sense of proportion tends to collapse. She wore a thin gold chain with a pendant that said Prez in diamond-studded block letters, the kind of jewelry that screams authority and whispers deep, unexamined insecurity at the same time. She applied lipstick before delivering bad news, a ritual she performed with the precision of a surgeon and the enthusiasm of a woman who genuinely enjoyed watching other people's faces fall. She had driven 2 families out of Ridgeview Bluffs before she turned her attention to me. The first was a teacher and her husband fined $1,300 for a basketball hoop that was 3 inches outside the approved recreation zone. A zone Brenda invented, printed on embossed cardstock, and distributed at the annual meeting the way a dictator distributes a constitution, unilaterally without debate and with the sincere belief that it was doing the country a favor. The second family left after Brenda determined that their flagpole was inconsistent with the community's visual harmony protocol. Visual harmony protocol. She made that up too. Nobody voted on it. Nobody asked for it. But Brenda Haskell didn't need votes the way runway models don't need permission to be tall. It was simply a condition she operated from, and everyone else was expected to adjust. The first letter arrived in March 2021. It was on Ridgeview Bluffs HOA stationery, cream-colored, linen-textured, embossed with a gold foil crest that looked like it had been designed by someone who aspired to British aristocracy, but had only ever visited a pottery barn, and it informed me that the helicopter landing facility on my property constituted a noise hazard visual disruption and potential safety threat to the residents of Ridgeview Bluffs estates. It requested that I voluntarily decommission and remove the landing area within 60 days to preserve the safety and aesthetic integrity of the surrounding community. My property was not in Ridgeview Bluffs Estates. I was not a member of the HOA. The letter had exactly as much legal authority over my helipad as a fortune cookie. It expressed a wish it cost nothing to produce, and the person who sent it genuinely believed it would change the outcome. I had my attorney Curtis Benavidez, 30 years of ranch property law in Burnett County, send a 1-page response explaining that my property was not within the HOA's jurisdiction, that the helipad was a registered FAA facility, and that any further correspondence should be directed to his office. Brenda did not direct further correspondence to his office. Brenda directed 11 more letters to my mailbox over the next 18 months, 4 on HOA stationery, 3 from attorneys threatening enforcement proceedings under provisions that applied exclusively to HOA members, 2 petitions, one with 53 signatures, one with 67, 2 personal notes from Brenda herself, handwritten in purple ink on monogrammed Crane stationery that probably cost $5 a sheet because even Brenda's threats needed to be delivered on premium paper. The last one said, and I will never forget this line, "Your little helicopter pad is going to go, Mr. Calloway, one way or another." I filed every letter in a folder labeled Brenda. By the end, it was thicker than the folder for my actual business contracts. The county responded to the petitions by sending an inspector. Dale Reeves, 19 years on the job. The kind of man who had seen every variety of neighbor dispute the hill country could produce, and approached each one with the patient, slightly exhausted calm of a veterinarian examining his 800th Labrador with a thorn in its paw. Dale drove out in May 2022. I met him at the Helipad with my FAA registration, county building permit, fuel storage permit, liability insurance, and a printed copy of FAA Advisory Circular 150/5390-2C. He looked at the pad, looked at the R-44 tied down on the apron, looked at the windsock turning lazy circles in the breeze, read the FAA registration. Then he said, "Mr. Calloway, this is the most by-the-book private heliport I've ever inspected, and I've inspected 11. I'm marking this complaint as unfounded." He paused. "Off the record, sir, I've received 23 calls about your property in 14 months. 21 of them came from the same phone number. 21 calls from one woman about a helipad that had been there for 24 years, a decade before her subdivision existed. But Brenda was not the kind of woman who accepted no as an answer. Brenda was the kind of woman who heard the word no and treated it like a challenge to her outfit, something to overcome with better accessories and a more determined stride. In August 2022, she filed a formal complaint directly with the FAA Southwest Regional Office. The complaint alleged that the Calloway Ridge heliport was abandoned in dangerous disrepair and that I was conducting reckless low-altitude operations over a populated residential area within close proximity to an elementary school. There is no elementary school within 5 miles of my property. The nearest school is 7.4 miles away, on the other side of a 600-foot limestone ridge. She lied to a federal agency. She fabricated a safety concern involving children, the last refuge of someone who has exhausted every legitimate argument and decided to weaponize the one thing nobody can publicly oppose, and filed it with the FAA in writing, with her name, address, and signature on the form, in purple ink, presumably because Brenda Haskell commits federal offenses with the same personal flair she brings to everything else. The FAA sent an aviation safety inspector named Tom Guzman from the Fort Worth FSDO, 2 hours on my property, every surface, every light, every document, every flight record. His report described the Calloway Ridge heliport as a well-maintained private-use facility in full compliance with applicable FAA standards, and noted that the complainant's allegations were not supported by physical evidence. What Brenda did not understand, what she would not understand until it was far too late, was that her false complaint was now in the FAA's system, documented, time-stamped, attributed to her by name, filed in a federal database that does not forget, does not lose paperwork, and does not care how beautiful you are, how expensive your handbag is, or how many diamonds are in your Prez necklace. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Brenda Haskell had one more move, and it was the one that would bring the full weight of the United States federal government down on her pearl-white Escalade, like a piano falling from a penthouse. On Monday, September 18, 2023, I flew to a wildfire assessment contract in the Davis Mountains 400 miles west. Colton stayed with my neighbor Hank Paulson, retired machinist, former Army mechanic, my father's closest friend for 40 years. I was flying grids over charred rangeland at sunrise Tuesday when my phone started buzzing. I checked at 11. 14 missed calls, 9 from Hank. 3 from Colton's school, 2 unknown. Hank's voicemail started steady and fell apart halfway through. "Nathan, you need to come home. There's a crew at your place, a bobcat, a dump truck, and 2 men with jackhammers. They're tearing up the helipad, the whole pad. Brenda Haskell's standing there in the road watching them do it. She told me the county authorized it. I called the county. They didn't authorize anything. Nathan, it's bad. They've already broken up most of the concrete. The windsock is down. The lights are ripped out. I tried to stop them. The foreman told me to leave or he'd call the police. I made 400 miles in 5 hours and 40 minutes. The helipad was gone. Where 60 by 60 feet of reinforced concrete had sat for 26 years, there was a crater of broken rubble, rebar stubs, and red Texas dirt. The concrete had been jackhammered into chunks the size of washing machines, stacked like the aftermath of an airstrike. The perimeter lighting destroyed, conduit torn out, wiring cut, fixtures crushed in the grass. The windsock mast bent at 45 degrees, lying across the equipment shed like a broken flagpole. The fuel storage tank dragged 20 feet by the Bobcat, scratched, dented, leaking avgas into the evening air. Colton was sitting on the porch steps. He was holding the model Black Hawk helicopter my father had given him on his 6th birthday. A die-cast replica of a UH-60M, the same airframe I'd flown in Iraq. He was holding it with both hands, the way he'd held the urn when we scattered my father's ashes. He looked up at me and said, "Dad, they broke Grandpa Roy's pad. The lady said it was ugly and it had to go." That is the sentence I will carry for the rest of my life. Hank told me later that Colton had come home from school, walked up the driveway, and stopped at the edge of the clearing. He stood there staring at the rubble without moving for a long time. Then he walked to the porch, reached through the screen window, pulled the model Black Hawk off his bookshelf, sat down, and held it in his lap. He'd been there for 3 hours. He hadn't gone inside, he hadn't eaten, he hadn't cried. He was just sitting in the place where something used to be, holding the last piece of it he could carry. The way children do when the world breaks, something they trusted would always be there. No 12-year-old should sit on a porch step and wonder why a woman in $400 leggings destroyed the only thing left of a grandfather he barely got to know. No kid should come home from school to find a piece of his family's history turned to gravel by someone whose biggest concern that morning was whether her Prada sunglasses matched her quilted vest. I found out later what Brenda was doing at 8 o'clock that morning, the exact moment the first jackhammer cracked concrete. She was at a boutique espresso bar in Marble Falls called Porch, ordering a $12 oat milk cortado with lavender foam. She posted it on her story. White marble countertop, the cortado in a ceramic cup, her nails freshly done in a shade called biscotti, and the caption, "Morning Rituals." At 8:12, when Rusty Phelps's crew drove the first hammer through the pad my father measured with a transit level and a plumb bob, Brenda Haskell was photographing her breakfast beverage. At 9:15, when the perimeter lights my father wired, one bulb at a time, were being ripped from the earth like weeds, she was browsing Dior's fall collection on her iPad. She arrived at the site at 9:45, fashionably late to her own crime, because punctuality, like legality, was something that applied to other people. The difference between those two mornings, hers and Colton's, was the difference between a woman who destroys things because she can, and a boy who grieves because he understands what was lost. One of them will carry this forever. The other probably carried it until her next cortado. We sat there until the stars came out. Then I told Colton to go inside, eat something, and get ready for bed. Then I started working. I walked the debris field the way you walk a crash site. Every step is evidence. Every fragment is testimony. I knelt next to a stump of rebar jutting from the dirt and ran my hand across the broken concrete. 26 years of Texas sun and rain and freeze-thaw cycles, and the aggregate was still dense, still bonded, still holding like the day it was poured. My father built things to last. That was the difference between him and the woman who ordered this. He measured twice, poured once, and expected his work to outlive him. It did. Until a woman who couldn't tell a J-bolt from a jewelry clasp decided it offended her aesthetic. I photographed everything. Every chunk of broken concrete, every crushed light fixture, every rebar stub, the fuel tank with bobcat scratches gouged into the steel like claw marks. Then I walked to the equipment shed and pulled the trail camera off the bracket where I'd mounted it 8 months earlier. After Brenda's letter that said one way or another, I'd installed a Reconyx Hyperfire on the shed eave, cellular upload, motion activated, time-stamped. Because when a woman who carries a Birkin to violation hearings tells you your helipad is going to disappear, you take her seriously. The footage was devastating. At 7:52 a.m. Tuesday, a white Ford F-350 pulling a Bobcat on a flatbed turned onto Calloway Ridge Road. At 7:58, a dump truck. At 8:04, Brenda Haskell's pearl white Cadillac Escalade, blue Prez, glided up behind them like a luxury cruise ship arriving at a demolition site. She stepped out wearing black Lululemon leggings, the Align 25-inch $88, because even crimes against property deserve moisture-wicking fabric, a matching quilted vest, white Nike Air Max sneakers, and Prada symbol sunglasses that retail for $450 and apparently provide excellent UV protection against the glare of moral accountability. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail. Her lips were freshly glossed. She looked like she was arriving at a Pilates brunch, not the destruction of a federal aviation facility. She spoke to the foreman, a demolition contractor named Rusty Phelps, for 3 minutes. During that conversation, she pointed at the helipad 4 times, at the windsock twice, and at the lighting fixtures once. Each gesture delivered with the casual authority of a woman who had never in her life been told that pointing at something did not make it hers. At 8:12, the first jackhammer started. She stayed for the entire demolition, 5 hours. She stood at the edge of the clearing with her arms crossed, her Escalade idling with the AC on, because standing near physical labor in September heat was simply not something Brenda Haskell's pores were prepared to endure. She sipped from a $40 Stanley tumbler, Adventure Quencher, matte pink limited edition. She checked her phone. She adjusted her sunglasses. She watched 2 men destroy a 26-year-old federally registered heliport built by a Vietnam veteran, and at one point she held up her phone, turned her back to the rubble, and took a selfie. A selfie, with the destruction of a dead man's legacy in the background. She probably posted it to her private Instagram with the caption, "Cleaning up the neighborhood," and 3 sparkle emojis because Brenda Haskell documented her crimes with the same instinct for aesthetics she brought to everything else. I watched that footage 3 times. Then I closed the laptop, poured 2 fingers of Maker's Mark into a glass my father used to drink from, and sat at the kitchen table until midnight. Then I picked up the phone and called the FAA. Not the general number, not a complaint form. I called the Fort Worth Flight Standards District Office directly and asked for Tom Guzman. "Tom, this is Nathan Calloway, Calloway Ridge Heliport. We met in November. I need to report the unauthorized destruction of a registered heliport." Tom was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "Say that again?" I said it again. I told him the facility he had personally inspected and certified as compliant was rubble, destroyed by a civilian with no authorization, federal, state, or county. He said, "Mr. Calloway, your heliport is listed in the airport master record. It is a registered aviation facility under FAA Order 5010.4b. Under 14 CFR Part 157, any construction, alteration, deactivation, or abandonment of a landing facility requires advance notice to the FAA. No notice was filed. The destruction of a registered heliport without FAA authorization is a federal matter." He paused. "And the lighting, the perimeter lighting, was part of an FAA-acknowledged lighting plan. Unauthorized destruction of aviation lighting implicates 49 U.S.C. Section 46308 interference with air navigation facilities. This isn't a code enforcement matter, Mr. Calloway. This is going to the regional office." I sat in the kitchen holding my father's glass and felt something I hadn't felt since my first combat mission in Kunar province. The absolute certainty that the person on the other end of this situation had no idea what they had started. Brenda Haskell had spent 2 years treating my helipad like an HOA violation, something to be eliminated with letters, petitions, and the sheer gravitational force of her personality. She had treated a federal aviation facility the way she treated a basketball hoop 3 inches out of bounds, as a personal irritation to be resolved by pointing at it with a manicured finger until it disappeared. And when none of that worked, she had hired a man with a jackhammer and paid him in cash, because even Brenda's felonies had to be off book. She didn't know she had never bothered to learn, because learning requires humility, and humility requires admitting that a Birkin bag is not a law degree. that the moment that jackhammer hit concrete, she had crossed a line that no HOA attorney, no county petition, and no amount of Prada-framed self-confidence could uncross. She had destroyed a facility under the jurisdiction of the Federal Aviation Administration, and the FAA does not issue fines on embossed stationery. The FAA does not have a severity slider. The FAA sends investigators in dark suits who do not care about your cheekbones or your Cartier watch, or the fact that your eyes look like aged bourbon in the afternoon light. They care about the law. And the law was about to care about Brenda. 2 weeks later, an FAA investigative team from the Southwest Regional Office arrived. 3 people. 2 days on my property, photographing damage, catalog of destroyed lighting, reviewing the airport master record. They took the trail camera footage. They took Brenda's name. They also pulled her August 2022 complaint, the one claiming the helipad was abandoned and in dangerous disrepair. They placed it next to the September 2023 demolition footage. A woman who told the FAA the helipad was abandoned had then hired a crew to destroy it. If it was abandoned, why demolish it? If it was in disrepair, why did the FAA's own inspector find it in full compliance 10 months earlier? The contradiction was not subtle. It was the kind of lie that looks clever for 10 minutes and then follows you into a federal courtroom like a stray dog that refuses to stop barking. The FAA referred the matter to the Department of Transportation Office of Inspector General. The OIG opened a formal investigation, citing 3 potential violations: unauthorized destruction of a registered aviation facility, unauthorized alteration without FAA notification, under 14 CFR Part 157, and filing a false complaint with a federal agency, under 18 U.S.C. Section 1001. Brenda found out on a Thursday afternoon in October, when 2 OIG investigators, a man and a woman, both in dark suits, both carrying credentials that said, United States Department of Transportation, rang the doorbell at Lot 7, Ridgeview Bluffs Estates. According to Hank, who heard the story from a neighbor who watched from across the cul-de-sac, Brenda opened the door in a matching aloe yoga set, airbrush collection Desert Toffee, approximately $320 for the ensemble, with her hair in a perfect bun and a green juice in her left hand. She saw the badges, she saw the suits, she saw the words Department of Transportation and Office of Inspector General on credentials held at eye level by 2 people who were not impressed by her bone structure. She went white. Not blushing fading to pale white, hospital white, fluorescent lighting in a government hallway white. The neighbor thought she was having a stroke. The green juice trembled. She said, "I need to call my attorney," and closed the door. The investigators left a card. Brenda's Escalade did not leave the garage for 3 days. The blue Prez plate sat in the darkness of a 3-car garage, while its owner presumably paced the limestone floors of a house she'd gotten for free and was about to discover was declining in value at a rate inversely proportional to her legal fees. But Brenda Haskell was constitutionally incapable of silence. Silence required self-awareness, and self-awareness was the one luxury item she'd never purchased, possibly because no designer has figured out how to embroider it on a handbag. Within a week, she counterattacked. She filed 3 code enforcement complaints against my property, alleging an unauthorized junkyard, the rubble that used to be my helipad, an open hazardous waste site, the fuel tank her contractor had damaged, and a derelict structure, the shed with the door her contractor had broken. She had destroyed my property and then complained about the mess she made. The logic was breathtaking. Burn the building, then call the fire department to complain about the smoke, file the insurance claim, then report yourself for fraud. It was the administrative equivalent of a toddler breaking a lamp and then telling the babysitter the lamp attacked first. She hired a new attorney, Gerald Montrose Austin, Congress Avenue office, $600 hourly rate. The kind of lawyer you hire when you need someone expensive enough to match your handbag, to argue that my property should be rezoned from agricultural to residential. She organized 14 homeowners in matching Ridgeview Bluffs polo shirts to appear at the Burnett County Commissioner's Court meeting, carrying signs that said, "Safety first, no airports in our backyards." The delegation arrived at the courthouse in a caravan of Range Rovers, Lexus SUVs, and one Mercedes G-Wagon driven by a woman who had never taken it off pavement but displayed the roof rack with the conviction that she might one day do something rugged. They filed into the public comment section, looking like a country club field trip that had taken a wrong turn at the zoning office. 3 of them carried matching water bottles. 2 had clearly never been inside a county government building before and appeared mildly concerned about the linoleum. Brenda stood at the front in a white blazer and cream silk blouse, her Birkin on the chair beside her like a silent co-counsel, her Cartier watch angled just so against the fluorescent light, because even civic engagement needed to be accessorized. She presented first. 5 minutes of prepared remarks delivered with the confidence of a woman who had never read a zoning ordinance, but had strong opinions about several of them. She used the phrase community safety 11 times, and the phrase property values 8 times, which, given that her own property value had already begun its descent, was the kind of irony that would have been delicious if it weren't so expensive. Commissioner Ruth Ann Dillard, 68 years old, cattle rancher family in Burnett County since 1847, a woman who had never in her life owned a piece of clothing that cost more than her saddle, listened for 22 minutes. Then she leaned into her microphone. "Ma'am, I have 2 questions. First, do you understand that a private helipad on agricultural land is not an airport? And second, are you the same Brenda Haskell who is currently under federal investigation for destroying the helipad you're now asking us to prevent from being rebuilt?" Brenda's attorney objected. Commissioner Dillard said, "This isn't a courtroom, counselor. It's a commissioner's meeting, and I read the Marble Falls Messenger just like everybody else." No commissioner moved to rezone. The delegation drove back to Ridgeview Bluffs in a convoy of luxury SUVs. Brenda's Escalade was last in line, the tinted windows up, the AC probably set to cryogenic, because Brenda Haskell would rather freeze to death than be seen sweating. Some people learn from public humiliation. Brenda just reapplied her lipstick and prepared for the next catastrophe. Meanwhile, I was building. I filed a new FAA Form 7480-1 for an upgraded heliport facility. I hired a surveyor from Austin Pillar, Navarro. 25 years of experience. I had a suspicion, and Peeler confirmed it in 3 days. The Ridgeview Bluffs entrance, decorative limestone wall, wrought iron gate, landscaped median with crepe myrtles uplighting and 15 feet of paved boulevard, encroached 23 feet onto Calloway family land. The developer had never obtained an easement, never purchased the strip, never asked. He had simply paved over my property line and put up a wall with gold lettering that said Ridgeview Bluffs Estates, because apparently, developers in the hill country treat other people's boundaries the way their HOA presidents treat other people's helipads, as aesthetic inconveniences to be corrected without permission. Curtis Benavides laughed for the first time in 2 years. "Nathan, don't do anything yet. Let's file the survey and the trespass claim and wait for the federal investigation. Right now, Brenda is fighting on 5 fronts and she doesn't even know about the 6th. My contractor, Carl Espinoza out of Llano, looked at the rubble, looked at the trail camera footage, and said, "Nathan, I can build you a pad twice as good in 3 weeks. She's lucky the FAA doesn't have a SWAT team." The new pad, 80 by 80 feet, 12 inches of reinforced concrete, LED perimeter lighting, 25-foot windsock mast with integrated anemometer, crisp white H markings against gray concrete, a new hurricane-rated equipment shed, and the hangar, 30 by 40 feet, prefabricated steel, climate-controlled rolling door, wide enough for the R-44. Permitted under Burnett County's agricultural building ordinance because a helicopter used for agricultural survey is agricultural equipment, and housing agricultural equipment in a barn is what agricultural land is for. I also called Burnett County Emergency Services. The EMS coordinator, Jess Garza, drove out the next day, looked at the new pad and said, "Mr. Calloway, we've needed a landing zone on this side of the ridge for 10 years. You just cut the response window from 22 minutes by ground to 8 minutes by air." She walked the pad twice, measured the touchdown area, checked the approach angles, and called her supervisor from my porch. Within a week, she had filed the paperwork. Within 2, a team from Starflight, Seaton's Trauma Air Service out of Austin, flew out for a site assessment. The flight nurse, a former Air Force pararescueman named Donald Whitaker, took one look at the pad, the approach corridor, the windsock, the lighting, and said, "This is better than half the hospital helipads I've landed on." He shook my hand and said, "Your old man knew what he was doing." He did. He always did. Jess told the Marble Falls Messenger that the Calloway Ridge LZ would serve as a primary landing zone for cardiac trauma and wildfire evacuation calls across the northern half of Burnett County. "This fills a gap we've had for a decade," she said. "The terrain on this side of the ridge makes ground transport slow and dangerous. Having a certified LZ here will save lives." There's no question about it. The Calloway Ridge Helipad became an official emergency medical and wildfire evacuation landing zone, marked on EMS dispatch maps, listed in the County Emergency Response Plan, available for Starflight and air evac operations. Jess told me something I haven't forgotten. She said, "Your father built this pad because he loved flying. You made it an LZ because you love this community. That's the difference between people who serve and people who sue." The woman who had called it a safety threat had destroyed a facility that once rebuilt became a public safety asset for every family within 15 miles. She wanted it gone because it didn't match her view. I rebuilt it as something that could save a life. The irony was not subtle. But then again, subtlety had never been Brenda Haskell's defining quality, unless you count the subtle art of committing a federal crime in Lululemon and Prada while carrying a $40 Stanley tumbler. The federal investigation concluded in January 2024. The DOT Office of Inspector General referred the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Texas. 3 findings: unauthorized destruction of a registered aviation facility without FAA notification, in violation of 14 CFR Part 157. Destruction of FAA-acknowledged perimeter lighting constituting interference with air navigation aids under 49 U.S.C. Section 463008, and filing a materially false complaint with the FAA in August 2022 in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 1001, making false statements to a federal agency. 18 U.S.C. Section 1001 carries a maximum penalty of 5 years imprisonment. It is not an HOA fine. It is not a sternly worded letter on cream-colored stationery. It is a federal criminal statute, and it does not come with a severity slider, a GPS tag, or an option to appeal to the Van Cleef bracelet on your wrist. The demolition contractor, Rusty Phelps, cooperated fully. His statement was simple. Brenda told him she was the HOA president, said the county had authorized removal of an old abandoned helicopter pad, and paid him $8,500 in cash. He had no reason to doubt her. He had never been asked to demolish a federally registered aviation facility before, and did not know such a thing existed. Rusty was not charged. He was a tool, not the criminal kind, the hardware kind. Brenda had pointed him at my helipad, the way she pointed at everything, with absolute authority and zero actual authorization. The civil case moved in parallel. Curtis filed a property damage lawsuit. The helipad was appraised at $215,000. Under Texas Property Code Section 28.003, Curtis asked for $430,000 double actual damages, plus attorney's fees and investigative costs. Then he opened the second folder, the boundary survey. 23 feet of Ridgeview Bluffs entrance infrastructure sitting on Calloway land without authorization. The estimated cost of removal and reconstruction would be approximately $1.4 million. Alternatively, my client is prepared to discuss a permanent easement for fair consideration. Gerald Montrose's face went through a color journey that started at lawyer tan and ended somewhere around freshly poured concrete. He asked for a 48-hour continuance. He used every minute. The mediation, January, Burnett County Courthouse. Curtis presented for 45 minutes. Trail camera footage, FAA registration, Inspector Guzman's compliance report, the 14 letters, the appraisal, the survey, and then the photograph of Colton sitting on the porch steps in his school clothes holding a model Black Hawk looking at the rubble of the helipad his grandfather built. The settlement was reached that afternoon. $430,000 in property damage and exemplary damages, $182,000 in retroactive easement fees, $38,000 in attorney's fees, a permanent recorded easement at $2,400 annually escalating with CPI. Total settlement $650,000. The HOA's insurance covered $380,000. The remaining $270,000 came from a special assessment of $2,300 per homeowner approved 91-4 with Brenda's written objection noted as her final official act. Every homeowner in Ridgeview Bluffs received a bill because their HOA president, a stunningly beautiful 38-year-old woman with perfect cheekbones, a diamond Prez necklace, and an absolute inability to distinguish between what she wanted and what the law allowed, decided that a helicopter pad registered with the federal government was a problem she could solve with a jackhammer and $8,500 in cash. The federal case resolved in March. Brenda pled guilty to making false statements to a federal agency, reduced to a misdemeanor, and willful destruction of a registered aviation facility. 18 months supervised probation, 300 hours of community service, $35,000 in restitution to the Burnett County Aviation Safety Fund. She appeared in federal court wearing a muted Burberry trench coat, flats instead of heels, and pearl studs instead of the Prez necklace, the first time anyone had seen her dressed down, as though the wardrobe itself had finally admitted what Brenda could not, that beauty, money, and expensive taste are not legal defenses, and that a woman who commits a federal crime in Lululemon will eventually have to answer for it in something considerably less flattering. Judge Rebecca Torres, 20 years on the federal bench, said during sentencing, "Ms. Haskell, the FAA exists to keep people safe. You used their complaint system to file a false report, and then you destroyed the facility you complained about. The irony is not lost on this court, nor is the cruelty." The state case trespass and criminal mischief added 12 months concurrent probation and $10,000 additional restitution. The board voted to remove Brenda as HOA president in April. The vote was 111-1. Brenda voted for herself because the woman who had never lost a vote in her HOA career was not about to start with the one that ended it. She wore a cream Chanel blazer and the Prez necklace to the removal meeting the way a deposed monarch wears the crown to the abdication ceremony, as though the outfit might overrule the verdict. It did not. Some women age out of power gracefully. Brenda accessorized through it. The new board's first act was a formal letter of apology to me. Their second act was to abolish the Visual Harmony Protocol, the View Corridor Preservation Task Force, and the Custom Enforcement app. The developer who built the app refunded the $6,000. He said it was the easiest ethical decision he'd ever made. Her home on Lot 7 was listed in May at $720,000. The listing agent photographed only the south-facing rooms. It sold in July for $685,000, a loss of $415,000 on a house she'd gotten for free in a divorce, a house she had destroyed the value of entirely by herself, one jackhammer at a time, one false complaint at a time, one embossed letter at a time. The buyer was a retired Air Force colonel named David Okada, who told me he liked the helicopter sounds because they reminded him of Hurlburt Field. He asked if Colton could see his collection of flight patches. Colton took the invitation very seriously. On a Saturday morning in May, 7 months after the settlement, I woke Colton at 5:30. "Get dressed, boots and a jacket, we're going flying." He was downstairs in 4 minutes. We walked to the helipad in the dark perimeter lights casting green and amber circles on the new concrete. I did the pre-flight by headlamp while Colton sat in the left seat and read the checklist out loud. The same checklist my father had taught me, the same words and the same order spoken in a voice that cracked the same way mine did at 12. We lifted off at first light, 500 feet, east toward the sunrise, cedar breaks and granite and cattle ponds catching the first gold of the morning, the light my father called pilot's gold because it only lasts 10 minutes and you have to be in the air to see it. Colton looked out the window, then he looked at me. "Dad, do you think Grandpa Roy can see us?" I told him I thought he could. I told him his grandfather flew over places a lot harder to see than the hill country, and that if Roy Calloway could find a landing zone in the Iadrang Valley at night, with tracers coming through the canopy, he could find his grandson flying over the ridge on a clear Texas morning. Colton nodded. "Can I fly the next one?" I told him he could. I told him that's what the helipad was for. We set down so gently the skids barely chirped on the concrete. Colton said it was the smoothest landing he'd ever seen. I told him that's what his grandfather said about my first one. At the edge of the pad, Carl had set a limestone post. Bolted to it a bronze plaque, the Roy Calloway Memorial Helipad, in memory of CW3 Roy Calloway Jr., 1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam, 1969-1970, builder of the original pad, 1997. If you want to fly, fly. But do it over something worth looking at. 3 months later, a rancher named Bill Crenshaw suffered a cardiac arrest 8 miles north. His wife called 911. Starflight was routed to the nearest emergency LZ, the Calloway Ridge Helipad. The medical helicopter landed on my father's pad in 11 minutes. Bill was in the cath lab at Seton Medical Center in Austin within 42 minutes. He survived. He sent me a Christmas card. The helipad your daddy built saved my life. Brenda Haskell called that helipad a safety threat. The pad she destroyed and the pad I rebuilt on the same ground saved a man's life because I turned her act of destruction into an act of service. She wanted it gone because it didn't match her view. It stayed because it matched something better, something she never had and never will, a purpose larger than herself. Brenda moved to a townhouse complex in Round Rock. No HOA presidency, no severity slider, no embossed stationery, no Birkin at violation hearings. Her LinkedIn still says community leader in the headline. Nobody has endorsed her for any skills, which is the most honest performance review she's ever received. Somewhere in Round Rock, in a townhouse with beige walls and no view, a stunningly beautiful woman with bourbon-colored eyes and a federal record is discovering what life looks like when you can't find, threaten, or jackhammer your way out of irrelevance. I hope the Nikes were comfortable. It's a long walk down from where she was standing. And there is no severity slider for the fall. My father used to say that the ground doesn't care who you are, it only cares what you build on it. I think about that every morning, standing on the pad he poured, watching the windsock turn in the hill country breeze, listening to the quiet before the engine starts. Roy's pad, Roy's ridge, our sky, and one pearl-white Cadillac Escalade with a blue Frez plate that will never park on Calloway Ridge Road again.
A woman this beautiful and this confident, with the Birkin, the diamond priest necklace, the escalate with vanity plates, decided that a federally registered helipad built by a Vietnamese version somehow fell under her HOA jurisdiction. She filed letter, petition, and filed complaints with the FAA. Then she hired a demolition crew to destroy it while the owner was 400 miles away and took a selfie with a rubber behind her. She thought she was removing an eyesore. She was commuting a federal offense. The FAA doesn't care about your Cartier watch. The DOT Inspector General doesn't care about your checkpoints. And the federal judge doesn't accept permits as a legal defense. She went from HOA president with a severity slider to federal probation with community service hour. The helipad she destroyed, they built bigger, better, and designated as an emergency metro landing zones that literally saved a man's life. That's the difference between someone who serves and someone who sues. If you've dealt with an HOA Karen who think her authority is unlimited, subscribe because this story proves it never is. Like this video if you think the selfies were the worst part.